There is a set of clay tablets in the Department of the Middle East at the British Museum in London. They are small. The largest surviving fragment is roughly 15 centimeters across. The clay is cracked, the edges chipped, and the surface is covered in rows of wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet clay more than 3,600 years ago. The tablets are written in Akkadian cuneiform. They were copied during the reign of Ammi-saduqa, king of Babylon, sometime between 1646 and 1626 BCE. The scribe who copied them wrote his name at the bottom. His name was Ipiq-Aya. He identified himself as a junior scribe. That colophon, that small act of professional identification at the end of a clay document, makes these tablets one of the oldest scribe-attributed literary manuscripts in the known archaeological record. The text Ipiq-Aya copied is called the Atrahasis. And what that text records, in a level of procedural detail that has troubled careful readers for more than a century, is not a flood myth. It is the minutes of a meeting at which one member of a governing body heard the final vote and decided the decision was wrong. The Atrahasis runs across 3 tablets. It is the oldest complete flood narrative in human literary history, predating the more famous version in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh by centuries in terms of original composition. The critical edition was published in 1969 by W.G. Lambert, Professor of Assyriology at the University of Birmingham, and A.R. Millard, Professor of Hebrew and Ancient Semitic Languages at the University of Liverpool, through Oxford University Press. Lambert and Millard spent years assembling fragments from the British Museum and the Yale Babylonian Collection in New Haven, Connecticut, piecing together the old Babylonian recension that Ipiq-Aya had copied. The work was painstaking. Cuneiform tablets from Nineveh and other excavation sites arrived at the British Museum in boxes of unsorted fragments, thousands of broken clay pieces that had to be identified, classified, and matched against known texts through patient comparison of script style, clay composition, and textual content. Many fragments of the Atrahasis were initially catalogued as unidentified mythological material and sat in museum storage for decades before Lambert recognized their connection to the larger narrative and began the reconstruction. The text they reconstructed tells a story in 3 movements. The first movement describes the creation of humanity from a mixture of clay and the blood of a slaughtered god. The second movement describes a series of escalating crises as humanity multiplies and the noise of human activity disturbs the senior gods. The third movement describes the decision to destroy humanity entirely through a catastrophic flood. But the text does not present this decision as the act of a single deity. It presents it as the outcome of a collective deliberation. A council convenes, arguments are made, a vote is taken, and then something happens that does not fit the mythological frame. The council imposes an oath, a specific, binding, contractual oath. The oath targets one member of the council in particular. His name is Enki. He is the god of wisdom, of fresh water, of craft and engineering. He has a record of siding with humanity. The council knows this. The oath is designed to bind him. And the text then records, in language that reads less like epic poetry and more like the transcript of a legal proceeding, the exact mechanism by which Enki circumvents the oath without technically violating its terms. He does not speak to a human being. He speaks to a wall made of reeds. And behind that wall, a man named Atrahasis listens. That distinction, the wall as intermediary, is not a poetic flourish, it is a loophole. Zecharia Sitchin, the researcher who spent decades reading Sumerian and Akkadian texts as literal administrative records rather than mythology, identified this passage as one of the most important in the entire cuneiform corpus. In The 12th Planet, published in 1976, and again in The Wars of Gods and Men in 1985, Sitchin argued that the Atrahasis does not describe gods in the theological sense. It describes administrators, a governing council, an executive body managing a biological labor force, which is what Sitchin contended humanity was engineered to be. And the flood, in Sitchin's reading, was not divine punishment. It was a predicted natural event, a catastrophic hydrological consequence of a celestial body's orbital return. which the council chose to exploit as a solution to what they considered a management problem. Enki did not run because he felt compassion. He ran because he had the data. He knew the timing, and his decision to circumvent the oath rather than break it tells you something about the system he was operating inside. The question that has not been answered in any peer-reviewed Assyriological journal since Lambert and Millard published their edition in 1969 is why a mythological text would preserve the specific mechanics of a legal workaround unless there was a legal framework to work around. If you find that the academic literature on texts like this has been incomplete, if you suspect there are records still sitting in museum storage that have been read as mythology when they might be something else entirely, this channel is built for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. The conventional reading of the Atrahasis is well established and internally coherent. Lambert and Millard themselves interpreted the text as a mythological exploration of the relationship between gods and humanity. In their framework, the Divine Assembly is a literary device reflecting what Thorkild Jacobson, the Harvard Sumerologist and author of The Treasures of Darkness, described as the political theology of ancient Mesopotamia. Jacobson argued that the Sumerians and their Akkadian successors modeled their divine pantheon on the structure of their own governance. City-states in early Mesopotamia operated through assemblies of elders and councils of leading citizens. The gods, in Jacobson's reading, behave the way Mesopotamian political bodies behave because the storytellers projected their own institutional structures onto the heavens. The assembly is a metaphor. The oath is a narrative mechanism. Enki's wall trick is a clever literary device meant to preserve dramatic tension. Stephanie Daly, Senior Research Fellow in Assyriology at the Oriental Institute at the University of Oxford, provided the most widely circulated English translation in her 1989 volume Myths from Mesopotamia, published in the Oxford World's Classics series and revised in 2000. Daly's translation follows the Lambert-Millard critical text closely and presents the Atrahasis within a framework of comparative mythology. The flood, in this reading, is not a historical event, but a literary motif shared across ancient Near Eastern cultures. The divine anger is triggered by overpopulation, by the noise of teeming humanity disturbing the sleep of the gods. This is read as an allegorical reflection of real anxieties about resource pressure and social instability in early urban Mesopotamia, where rapid population growth in the 3rd millennium BCE placed measurable strain on the irrigation infrastructure, the grain storage systems, and the administrative capacity of the city-state governments that managed them. The overpopulation reading maps the Atrahasis onto a recognizable historical pattern and gives it a sociological function as a narrative that explores the tension between growth and sustainability in the context of the earliest complex societies in human history. Samuel Noah Kramer, professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and the scholar who arguably did more than any single individual to bring Sumerian literature to the English-speaking world, documented the Sumerian antecedent traditions underlying the Akkadian Atrahasis and placed them within a broader literary corpus of creation and flood narratives. Kramer's history begins at Sumer, first published in 1956, remains one of the most influential surveys of Sumerian literary achievement. He traced the flood tradition back through Sumerian prototypes that predate the Akkadian Atrahasis by centuries, demonstrating that the narrative had deep roots in the earliest literate civilization on record. A. Leo Oppenheim, the Assyriologist who directed the Assyrian Dictionary Project at the University of Chicago for decades, approached Mesopotamian religious texts with particular caution in his 1964 volume, Ancient Mesopotamia, arguing that modern readers consistently overinterpret the theological content of cuneiform literature and underestimate its institutional and bureaucratic dimensions. Even Oppenheim, who came closer than most mainstream scholars to acknowledging the administrative texture of these texts, stopped short of reading the Divine Assembly as anything other than a literary projection. In the conventional frame, the Atrahasis is an important but ultimately literary text. The gods are characters, the assembly is a stage. The oath is a plot device, and Enki's decision to speak to a reed wall is a storyteller's solution to a narrative problem. The flood deposits excavated by Leonard Woolley at in the 1920s, thick, sterile layers of water-laid silt separating occupation levels, were initially taken as evidence for a historical flood. But subsequent archaeological work demonstrated that flood deposits at different Mesopotamian sites dated to different periods, undermining the case for a single catastrophic event. The conventional conclusion hardened. The flood was a literary motif, not a historical memory. This reading is consistent, well-sourced, and held by the majority of working Assyriologists. It is also incomplete, because it does not explain why the storyteller chose that particular solution. A god who simply defies the other gods is a common mythological figure. A god who finds a contractual loophole in a binding oath is something else. That distinction is where the conventional reading stops and a different kind of reading begins. Sitchin's reading begins with the text itself, not with theory, not with speculation about planets or orbital mechanics, with the words on the clay. The Atrahasis, in the Lambert Millard edition, preserves a sequence in Tablet 2 that describes the divine council's deliberation in escalating stages. The gods do not simply decide to send a flood, they try other measures first. They send plague. Namtar, the god of pestilence, is unleashed on humanity. The population declines. But Enki intervenes. He instructs Atrahasis to organize offerings specifically directed at Namtar, redirecting cultic attention in a way that placates the plague god and halts the epidemic. The council responds. They send famine. The rains are withheld. The fields dry. Adad, the storm god, is commanded to hold back his waters. Again, the population declines. Again, Enki intervenes. He teaches Atrahasis to redirect offerings, this time to Adad, and the rains resume. The text records this cycle with a specificity that Lambert himself acknowledged was unusual for mythological narrative. Each intervention follows a pattern. The council imposes a measure. Enki finds a countermeasure. The council escalates. The specificity is not in the imagery. It is in the procedure. Each divine measure is described as an administrative action with identifiable agents, identifiable targets, and identifiable counteractions. The text does not say the gods were angry and bad things happened. It says a specific deity was assigned to deliver a specific measure against a specific population through a specific mechanism, and that another specific deity intervened to neutralize the measure through a specific counter-mechanism that exploited the original mechanism's operational parameters. The level of specificity in the escalation sequence is not what you find in mythology. It is what you find in an after-action report. Sitchin read this sequence and saw something that the conventional framework had no reason to look for. He saw minutes, administrative minutes of an escalating policy dispute between factions within a governing body. The faction led by Enlil, the chief executive of the council, wanted the human population eliminated, or at minimum, drastically reduced. The faction represented by Enki, who in Sitchin's reading had been directly involved in humanity's biological engineering, opposed the elimination on practical and perhaps personal grounds. The plague-famine-drought sequence is not a mythological trope. It is a record of failed policy implementations, each one undermined by internal opposition from a council member with both the technical knowledge and the institutional access to sabotage the program from within. Sitchin was not an Assyriologist by academic training. He was born in Baku, Azerbaijan in 1920, raised in Palestine, and educated at the London School of Economics. He taught himself to read cuneiform over the course of decades, working primarily from published transliterations and sign lists rather than from the tablets themselves. His critics have never let that fact go unmentioned, and it is a legitimate point of methodological concern that any honest assessment of his work must acknowledge. But the observation he made about the Atrahasis does not depend on disputed translations of individual signs. It depends on narrative structure. The escalation pattern in Tablets 1 and 2 follows a logic that is recognizable to anyone who has read the minutes of a contentious institutional body. A policy is proposed. It is implemented through a designated agent. It fails because of internal opposition. The policy is revised and re-implemented through a different agent. It fails again for the same reason. The governing body concludes that the problem is not the policy, but the internal opposition, and moves to neutralize the dissenter before implementing a final, irreversible measure. That structure is not mythological, it is bureaucratic, and Sitchin, whatever his limitations as a philologist, identified it clearly. Then the council changes strategy. They do not simply impose another measure, they impose an oath. The text is explicit. The gods swear together, they bind themselves collectively to the decision to send the flood. And the oath specifically targets Enki. He is named, he is bound. The text makes clear that the other council members know Enki has been undermining their previous measures. The oath is designed to prevent him from doing it again. This is not a narrative device. A narrative device does not need to specify the legal mechanism of enforcement. A plot requires only that the audience understand the constraint. But the Atrahasis does not merely establish a constraint. It specifies the form of the constraint, the collective nature of the swearing, and the targeted application to a specific dissenting member. It reads like a contract clause. And what Enki does next confirms the reading. He goes to the reed hut where Atrahasis sleeps. He does not enter. He does not speak to the man. He addresses the wall, the reed wall of the hut. He tells the wall about the coming flood. He tells the wall to build a boat. He tells the wall the dimensions of the vessel and the materials required. And Atrahasis, lying on the other side of the reeds, hears everything. The technical precision of this moment is what Sitchin identified as the signature of an administrative record. A mythological text does not need to explain how the hero learned of the flood. It can simply state that a god appeared to him in a dream, or spoke to him directly, or sent a messenger. The Gilgamesh version, composed later and reaching its canonical form in the standard Babylonian edition, attributed to the scribe Sinleki-Unini, does exactly that. It simplifies. The divine assembly scene in Gilgamesh Tablet 11 is compressed. The oath is mentioned, but not detailed. The reed wall episode is present but streamlined, with fewer procedural specifications and more narrative momentum. The simplification makes the Gilgamesh version a better story. It also makes it a worse record. And the direction of the simplification is telling. Later versions of the same tradition reduce the procedural content while preserving the narrative arc, which is exactly what you would expect if the original contained documentary material that later redactors considered unnecessary for literary purposes. But the Atrahasis does not simplify, it preserves the mechanism. It preserves the legal distinction between speaking to a person and speaking to an object in the proximity of a person. That distinction only matters if the oath is real. If the oath is a plot device, the workaround is an unnecessary complication. A writer constructing a myth does not need to invent a legal technicality. A writer constructing a myth needs a dramatic scene. The dramatic version is simple. The god defies the council, speaks to the man, and accepts the consequences. That version is more powerful as narrative. It is more emotionally satisfying. It creates a clear moral arc. The Atrahasis does not do that. The Atrahasis inserts a procedural step between the god and the man that diminishes the dramatic impact of the scene in exchange for legal precision. That is not a storytelling choice. That is a documentary choice. And it is the single most important structural detail in the entire text, because it tells you what kind of document you are reading. If the oath is a binding instrument, the workaround is the entire point. The Book of Enoch, preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon and dating in its earliest layers to the 3rd century BCE, describes a strikingly similar factional rupture among a governing class of divine beings called the Watchers. That parallel is not incidental. It will matter later. But here, in the Atrahasis, the procedural detail is the evidence. And no mainstream Assyriological publication has addressed why that detail exists. The implications of Sitchin's reading do not stop at the oath. If the Atrahasis records the minutes of a real administrative body, then the entire pre-flood sequence becomes a policy document. The plague that Namtar delivers is not divine wrath. It is a targeted biological intervention. The famine that Adad enforces by withholding rain is not a curse. It is an engineered resource restriction. The flood itself is not punishment. It is the final measure in an escalation sequence that began with less catastrophic approaches and moved to total elimination only after internal sabotage made lesser measures ineffective, and Enki's role transforms. He is not a compassionate god moved by the suffering of his creatures. He is a dissenting administrator with technical expertise and institutional access, running a covert resistance campaign against a policy he considers wrong. His repeated interventions follow the same pattern because they exploit the same structural vulnerability. The council operates through designated agents. Namtar delivers plague, Adad withholds rain. Enki redirects the cultic and material responses of the human population to neutralize each agent's effectiveness. He does not overpower the other gods. He outmaneuvers them, every time. And the text tells you how. It names the agents. It names the countermeasures. It records the sequence with the kind of procedural fidelity that makes sense only if someone was keeping track. The pattern of covert resistance that Enki runs across tablets 1 and 2 of the Atrahasis is not the behavior of a deity expressing mythological compassion. It is the behavior of a highly placed insider with access to classified operational details who systematically undermines each initiative while maintaining plausible deniability within the institutional structure. The text does not describe Enki publicly opposing the council's decisions. It describes him working within the system, using the system's own mechanisms against itself, by redirecting cultic practices that the other council members had not anticipated as a vulnerability in their enforcement strategy. Each time the council discovers that its measure has failed, it does not immediately identify Enki as the source of the failure. It takes multiple rounds of sabotage before the council explicitly targets him with the oath. That delay is itself evidence of institutional blindness, the kind of blindness that organizations exhibit when they cannot imagine that one of their own senior members is actively working against them. Consider what this means if taken at face value. The creation of humanity, described in Tablet 1 of the Atrahasis, involves the slaughter of a god named Gesh-2a, whose blood is mixed with clay to produce a new being capable of labor. In the conventional reading, this is a creation myth expressing the idea that humanity contains a divine element. In Sitchin's reading, it is a record of a biological engineering procedure in which genetic material from one species was combined with the biological substrate of another to produce a hybrid worker. The labor dispute that precedes the creation, in which the Igigi gods refuse to continue digging canals and maintaining irrigation infrastructure, is the administrative crisis that motivates the engineering project. Humanity is created to replace the Igigi labor force. The Atrahasis is explicit about this. The purpose of the new creature is to bear the toil of the gods. That phrase is not metaphorical in the text. It is functional. Humanity exists, in the Atrahasis, to perform physical labor that another class of beings has refused to perform. If humanity is a labor force, then the subsequent overpopulation crisis is not a theological abstraction. It is a management problem. The noise that disturbs Enlil is not spiritual pollution. It is the practical consequence of an uncontrolled population of biological workers expanding beyond the parameters of the original program. The plague is not divine anger. It is population control. The famine is not a curse. It is resource restriction. And the flood is not punishment. It is decommissioning. The entire arc of the Atrahasis, from creation, through crisis, through attempted destruction, reads as the life cycle of a managed biological program that exceeded its design parameters and was slated for termination. Enki's opposition to the termination makes sense within this framework, not because he is compassionate, but because he is the engineer who designed the program. His investment is professional as much as personal. He built this species. He knows what it cost. The Atrahasis is clear on this point. The creation of humanity required the sacrifice of a god. Divine blood was the essential ingredient. The project was not cheap, not reversible, and not easily replicated. Every human being walking the earth in the Atrahasis narrative carries biological material derived from a divine source. Destroying the entire population means destroying the product of that sacrifice. It means wasting the blood of Gesh-2a. The idea of annihilating the entire product line because the management structure failed to control output is, to Enki, an unacceptable waste of irreplaceable resources. The timeline matters. The Atrahasis places the creation of humanity before the flood by a span that the text marks with generational language rather than precise numbers. But the Sumerian king list, preserved on the Weld Blundell prism held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford and first translated by Stephen Langdon in 1923, records 8 antediluvian kings reigning for a combined total of 241,200 years. The king list is a physical artifact, a 4-sided clay prism inscribed on all faces with a continuous record of kingship from the beginning of civilization through the historical period. It is approximately 20 centimeters tall and is one of the most important chronological documents in the entire Mesopotamian corpus. The conventional reading treats the antediluvian reign lengths as symbolic or as a product of a different counting system, perhaps a base 60 calculation that was misinterpreted by later scribes or that served a numerological rather than a chronological function. Sitchin treated them as data. If the antediluvian period spanned hundreds of thousands of years, then the overpopulation crisis described in the Atrahasis represents the demographic result of a long-running biological program left to reproduce without constraint over deep time. The scale of the crisis matches the scale of the timeline, and the administrative response, escalating from plague to famine to flood, matches the severity of a problem that has been compounding for millennia rather than generations. The entire framework coheres internally. The question is whether internal coherence constitutes evidence or merely reflects the skill of the interpreter. If you want to verify the textual basis of this reading, the Lambert Millard critical edition is still in print through Oxford University Press. The Akkadian text is provided alongside the English translation. The passages describing the plague sequence, the oath, and the reed wall episode are available to anyone who wants to read them. The argument does not require you to trust Sitchin. It requires you to read the text and decide whether the procedural detail is literary or documentary. The chain of consequences extends further than the flood itself. If Enki's warning was based on calculable orbital data, then the Atrahasis preserves not only the record of a political rupture, but also the record of a predictive science. The text implies that at least one member of the governing council possessed knowledge of celestial mechanics sufficient to forecast a major geological event with enough lead time to design and execute a survival plan. That is not theology. It is engineering, and the Enuma Elish, which Sitchin read as the foundational cosmological text describing the entry of the predicted body into the solar system, provides the theoretical framework within which that prediction would have been possible. The Enuma Elish describes a sequence of celestial events involving the collision and gravitational interaction of planetary bodies, a cosmogonic narrative that begins with primordial water deities and proceeds through a series of celestial conflicts to produce the solar system in its current configuration. The conventional reading treats this as creation mythology, an imaginative account of cosmic origins using divine personification of natural forces. Sitchin treated it as observational astronomy, encoded in narrative form. The distinction between these two readings has never been adjudicated in a peer-reviewed astronomical journal. The astronomers dismiss the Nibiru hypothesis on observational grounds. The Assyriologists dismiss it on philological grounds. Neither group has addressed the structural argument about the Atrahasis narrative, and that structural argument is where the real question lives, not in the stars, in the text. The clay tablets that preserve it are fragile, damaged, and incomplete. Portions of the narrative are missing where the clay has cracked or eroded, but the portions that survive are sufficient to establish the structural architecture of the account. The assembly convenes, the escalation proceeds, the oath binds, the dissenter acts. The reed wall transmits, the flood comes, and the species survives by a margin so narrow that it depends on a single legal technicality embedded in a single passage of a single clay tablet, copied by a junior scribe more than 3,500 years ago. The geographic specificity of the text reinforces the procedural reading. The events of the Atrahasis are set in southern Mesopotamia, in the alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a region that is demonstrably vulnerable to catastrophic flooding and that sits at or near sea level across much of its extent, with the Persian Gulf forming the southeastern boundary of the plain. The entire southern Mesopotamian lowland is a depositional environment, built up over millennia by river sediment, carried down from the Zagros Mountains to the east and the highlands of Anatolia to the north, and any significant rise in sea level or disruption of the regional hydrology would produce inundation on a massive scale across the inhabited plain. Leonard Woolley, the British archaeologist who excavated beginning in 1922, discovered a thick stratum of sterile, water-deposited silt separating occupation layers at the site. The deposit was approximately 3.5 meters deep. Woolley initially announced that he had found evidence of the biblical flood, and the discovery made international headlines in the 1920s. The claim was dramatic, and the public response was enthusiastic, but subsequent archaeological work across multiple Mesopotamian sites complicated the picture significantly. But the deposits confirmed that catastrophic inundation events did occur in the region during the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE. The question is not whether floods happened. The question is whether one specific flood, of sufficient magnitude to register as a civilizational extinction event, corresponds to the event described in the Atrahasis. Sitchin argued that it does, and that the text provides the key to its cause. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, contains a cosmogonic sequence that Sitchin interpreted as describing the orbital insertion of a large planetary body into the inner solar system. That body, which the text names using a term conventionally translated as crossing point, is what Sitchin identified as Nibiru. In his framework, the periodic return of this body on an elongated orbit produces gravitational effects sufficient to trigger massive tidal and hydrological disruption in low-lying coastal and riverine regions. The flood was not sent, it was calculated. Enki did not run because he disagreed with a policy. He ran because he had access to the orbital data. He knew when the body would return. He knew what the return would do to the water table of southern Mesopotamia, and his decision to warn Atrahasis was not an act of sentiment. It was an act of applied science performed under conditions of institutional prohibition, using a communication method designed to satisfy the technical requirements of a binding oath, while transmitting the essential information to the one individual positioned to act on it. The Atrahasis specifies the construction of the vessel in terms that suggest engineering parameters rather than mythological symbolism. The boat is to be roofed. It is to be sealed with bitumen, the naturally occurring petroleum product that has been available in southern Mesopotamia for millennia and that was used extensively in ancient construction for waterproofing. The text specifies that Atrahasis is to load the vessel with his family, with craftspeople and with animals. The conventional reading treats these details as standard flood narrative motifs shared across ancient Near Eastern literature. The procedural reading treats them as logistics. If you know the approximate magnitude of the coming inundation, you can calculate the specifications of a survival vessel. If you know the duration, you can calculate the provisions required to sustain the occupants through the event and the immediate aftermath. The Atrahasis provides construction specifications that, while not dimensionally precise in the surviving fragments, indicate a vessel of substantial size designed for extended flotation under catastrophic conditions. And if you are transmitting this information covertly through a reed wall to avoid detection by a governing body that has specifically prohibited you from communicating it, you are going to be precise. You do not have time for allegory. The reed wall stands at the center of the entire narrative. It is the hinge on which the survival of the species turns, and the text treats it not as a symbol but as an instrument. The question is whether any of this constitutes evidence. The tablets are real. The text is real. The procedural detail is in the Lambert Millard edition for anyone to verify. The geographic vulnerability of southern Mesopotamia to catastrophic flooding is confirmed by multiple archaeological excavations across the 20th century. The celestial mechanical hypothesis remains unconfirmed by direct astronomical observation, but the textual argument does not depend on whether Nibiru exists. It depends on whether the Atrahasis reads as a procedural record, and the conventional response to that specific question has been consistent. It has been silence. Sitchin published The 12th Planet in 1976. It was his first book. It laid out his core argument in detail, complete with references to specific cuneiform texts, named museum holdings, and his own translations of key passages. The book sold millions of copies across multiple editions and was translated into more than 25 languages. The academic response was not a counter-argument. It was a classification. Sitchin was placed in the category of pseudo-archaeology, alongside Eric von Daniken, Graham Hancock, and other popular writers whose work sits outside the institutional boundaries of credentialed scholarship. The classification was efficient. It meant that no Assyriologist needed to engage with the specific textual arguments in the 12th planet because the book had already been designated as non-academic. Peer review does not apply to non-academic work. Refutation is not required for claims that have been pre-categorized as fringe. The mechanism is circular but effective. The work is excluded from the discourse because it is not part of the discourse, and it is not part of the discourse because it has been excluded. This circularity is not unique to the treatment of Sitchin. It characterizes the institutional response to a wide range of heterodox scholarship in the humanities and social sciences. The classification of a body of work as pseudo-scholarship serves a gatekeeping function that operates independently of the quality of individual arguments within that body of work. Once the classification is applied, the institutional incentive structure discourages engagement. A junior Assyriologist who published a peer-reviewed paper engaging seriously with Sitchin's structural arguments about the Atrahasis would risk professional marginalization, not because the arguments are necessarily wrong, but because engaging with them signals a willingness to treat classified as fringe material as worthy of academic attention. The cost of that signal, in terms of career advancement and collegial reputation, is high enough to deter all but the most independently secure scholars from attempting it. The result is a self-reinforcing silence that persists not because the questions have been answered, but because the professional consequences of asking them are prohibitive. This is not to say that Sitchin's work is without problems. It has problems. Michael S. Heiser, who held a doctorate in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and who died in 2023, spent a significant portion of his career cataloging those problems. Heiser's website, dedicated specifically to challenging Sitchin's translations, represents the most sustained and detailed linguistic critique of Sitchin's cuneiform readings that has ever been published by a credentialed Semitic language scholar. Heiser argued that Sitchin made systematic errors in his treatment of Sumerian and Akkadian vocabulary, particularly around the term that Sitchin rendered as the name of a specific planetary body. Heiser demonstrated, using standard cuneiform lexical lists available to any researcher with access to the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary or the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, that the term in question appears in multiple contexts meaning crossing point, ferry, or junction, and that Sitchin's identification of it as a proper astronomical noun referring to a specific undiscovered planet is not supported by the lexicographic evidence as it currently exists in the published reference literature. These are serious objections. They are specific. They engage with the actual cuneiform, and they are precisely the kind of objection that advances a debate rather than shutting one down. But Heiser's critique has a boundary. It addresses Sitchin's vocabulary. It addresses his translation methodology. It addresses individual word choices and their lexical support. What it does not address is the structural argument about the Atrahasis. Heiser never published a response to the observation that the Atrahasis preserves a procedural escalation sequence, an oath mechanism, and a legal workaround. His critique targeted the planetary hypothesis and the specific linguistic claims that supported it. The broader question, whether the Atrahasis reads as an administrative document rather than a mythological one, remains outside the scope of any published academic response. And that is the question that matters most to this particular analysis. Because you can reject Sitchin's translations entirely, you can accept every one of Heiser's linguistic corrections, and the structural observation about the text still stands. The procedural detail in the Atrahasis is there regardless of what the word Nibiru means. The oath is there, the escalation sequence is there, the reed wall is there, the legal distinction between direct and indirect communication is there. None of these features require Sitchin's planetary hypothesis to be significant. They require only that someone read the text and notice the pattern. This is worth pausing on. The most rigorous critique of Sitchin ever produced by a credentialed scholar in the relevant field does not address the central structural observation about the Atrahasis. It addresses peripheral claims. Important peripheral claims, to be sure, but peripheral nonetheless. If you strip away the planetary hypothesis, if you strip away the contested vocabulary, if you accept every correction Heiser offered, you are still left with a text that describes a governing council swearing a binding oath designed to prevent a specific dissenter from leaking classified information, and that same dissenter finding a technical workaround that satisfies the letter of the oath while violating its intent. That is not a translation dispute, that is a reading comprehension observation available to anyone who opens the Lambert Millard edition and reads the relevant passages in English. No specialist knowledge is required, and no specialist has responded. The pattern extends beyond Sitchin. Graham Hancock, the British journalist and author of Fingerprints of the Gods, published in 1995, faced similar treatment when he argued that multiple ancient flood traditions might preserve memories of a real catastrophic event at the end of the last ice age. Hancock's specific geological and archaeological claims have been debated, and some have been contested in peer-reviewed settings. But the broader pattern, the tendency of mainstream institutions to classify rather than refute, to designate work as pseudoscience rather than demonstrate where its specific claims fail, is consistent. Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University, proposed in the early 1990s that the water weathering patterns on the Great Sphinx at Giza indicated a construction date thousands of years earlier than the conventional attribution to the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khafre. Schoch's credentials are not in dispute. His methodology is geological, not speculative. He presented his findings at the Geological Society of America and defended them in professional venues where his expertise was acknowledged, even by those who disagreed with his conclusions. The response from mainstream Egyptology was not a detailed geological counterstudy demonstrating alternative weathering mechanisms that could account for the observed erosion patterns. It was a characterization. The work was labeled fringe. The geological evidence was not systematically addressed in peer-reviewed Egyptological literature for years. The pattern is consistent. When a credentialed researcher proposes an interpretation that challenges the consensus timeline or the consensus explanatory framework, the institutional response prioritizes classification over engagement. The work is sorted into a category that exempts it from the normal obligations of scholarly response, and the specific technical arguments within the work are never addressed on their own terms. The silence that surrounds these arguments is not the silence of answered questions. It is the silence of questions that the institution has decided not to hear. The asymmetry is consistent across decades. No Assyriological journal has published a paper specifically examining the procedural structure of the Atrahasis divine assembly sequence and arguing that it is consistent with mythological convention rather than documentary record. The closest approximation is Jacobson's work on divine assemblies, which acknowledges their political character but frames that character as a projection of human governance onto the divine, rather than a record of actual governance. Jacobson's framework is elegant. It explains the political texture of the assembly passages as a literary strategy. But it does not explain the specificity of the oath mechanism, the targeting of a named dissenter, or the legal workaround. A literary projection of political governance does not typically include contract law. Mesopotamian literary texts are not short on divine assemblies. The gods meet, deliberate, and decide throughout the cuneiform corpus. But the level of procedural detail in the Atrahasis is unusual. Lambert acknowledged this. His solution was to attribute it to the skill of the old Babylonian literary tradition. But skill in storytelling does not explain why a storyteller would choose to insert procedural complexity that reduces narrative impact. The dramatic version is always simpler. The documented version is always more complex. The Atrahasis chose complexity, and the academic establishment has chosen not to discuss why. The silence is not neutral. Silence in academia is a signal. It tells you what a field considers beneath engagement. It tells you where the boundaries of acceptable inquiry have been drawn. And in this case, the boundary has been drawn around a question that is not speculative, not dependent on contested translations, and not about planets. It is a question about narrative structure, in a well-published cuneiform text held in one of the most prestigious museums in the world. The question is sitting in room 55. It has been sitting there since the tablets arrived from Nineveh, and the reason it remains unanswered is not that it is unanswerable. It is that answering it would require acknowledging that the question is legitimate, and acknowledging that the question is legitimate would require reclassifying the people who asked it. The institutional cost of that reclassification is enormous, because it extends beyond the specific question about the Atrahasis to the broader framework within which alternative researchers have been categorized for the past half-century. If Sitchin's structural observation about the Atrahasis is legitimate, it does not mean that everything Sitchin wrote is correct. But it means that the blanket classification of his work as pseudo-archaeology was premature, and that the institutional gatekeeping that prevented engagement with his textual arguments deprived the field of a potentially productive line of inquiry for decades. The cost of acknowledging that error is apparently higher than the intellectual cost of the silence that avoids it. That is the dismissal, not an argument, not a refutation, a decision about what questions deserve to be taken seriously and who gets to make that decision. The city where the scribe Ipiq-Aya most likely sat and pressed his reed stylus into wet clay was Sippar. Sippar was one of the great urban centers of the old Babylonian period, located on the eastern bank of the Euphrates River in what is now central Iraq, roughly 35 kilometers southwest of modern Baghdad. It was a city of temples and scribal schools, a place where the intellectual traditions of Sumer and Akkad were curated, copied, and transmitted to new generations of scholars. The scribal curriculum in Old Babylonian Sippar was rigorous. Students spent years learning the basics of cuneiform sign recognition, graduated to copying standard literary texts, and eventually earned the privilege of copying major works from the canon. Ipiq-Aya identified himself as a junior scribe, which means the Atrahasis was likely part of his advanced training, a prestige text considered worthy of careful transmission. That tells you something about the status of the document. It was not marginalia. It was not an obscure local tradition. It was a text that the scribal establishment considered important enough to require precise copying. The world Ipiq-Aya inhabited was one of profound literary awareness. The Old Babylonian period, spanning roughly the 20th to the 16th centuries BCE, was one of the great ages of cuneiform literary production. The scribes of this era did not merely copy texts, they edited them, they compiled variant traditions, they organized libraries. The literary output of Old Babylonian scribal schools included hymns, prayers, omen compendia, mathematical tablets, legal codes, and epic narratives. The Atrahasis existed within this ecosystem as a major work, one that told the story of humanity from its creation to its near destruction and survival. The fact that it was copied by a named scribe during a specific king's reign gives it a provenance that many ancient texts lack. We know approximately when Ipiq-Aya worked, we know approximately where he worked, and we know that the text he copied was old even by his standards. The Atrahasis that Ipiq-Aya transmitted was itself a copy of an older tradition. The Sumerian antecedents of the flood narrative can be traced back to at least the late 3rd millennium BCE through fragments recovered from the site of Nippur, the religious center of the Sumerian world, located approximately 160 kilometers southeast of modern Baghdad. Samuel Noah Kramer, working with fragments at the University of Pennsylvania Museum in the mid-20th century, identified Sumerian flood texts that predated the Akkadian Atrahasis by several centuries. The narrative core was remarkably stable across these versions. A divine assembly decides, a dissenting god warns a human, a flood destroys civilization, a remnant survives. The details shift between Sumerian and Akkadian versions, names change, emphasis varies, but the structural architecture remains constant. The procedural elements, the assembly, the oath, the covert warning, are present in the earliest recoverable layers of the tradition. They are not late additions, they are not Akkadian innovations. They appear to be foundational. The later history of the text confirms its importance. When Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria in the 7th century BCE, assembled the great library at Nineveh, that would eventually yield more than 30,000 cuneiform tablets to modern archaeology. The Atrahasis was among the texts his scribes collected and copied. Ashurbanipal was not merely a patron of literature, he was, by his own account, inscribed on surviving tablets, literate in cuneiform himself, trained in the scribal arts, and personally invested in the preservation of Mesopotamian intellectual heritage. His library was not a random accumulation. It was a deliberate archival project, an attempt to gather the essential texts of Babylonian and Sumerian tradition into a single accessible repository. The inclusion of the Atrahasis in this collection tells you that nearly 1,000 years after Ipiq-Aya made his copy in Old Babylonian Sippar, the text was still considered essential, still canonical, still worth the labor of copying onto fresh clay in the Neo-Assyrian script of the 7th century BCE. The library of Ashurbanipal is where Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam would eventually recover the tablets that now sit in the British Museum, and it is through the Neo-Assyrian copies that most readers first encounter the Atrahasis, even though the text itself is far older than the library that preserved it. The transmission chain matters because it tells you how the text was treated by the cultures that preserved it. A story that is merely entertaining gets modified freely. Details are embellished, characters are added, plot lines are reshaped to suit local tastes. A document that is considered authoritative gets transmitted with care. The scribal schools of Mesopotamia distinguished between literary creativity and textual fidelity. When a scribe copied a hymn for practice, variations were expected. When a scribe copied a canonical text, precision was demanded. The colophon tradition itself, the practice of recording the scribe's name, the date, and the source of the copy, is an artifact of the documentary rather than the literary mode. Ipiq-Aya signed his copy not because he was an author, but because he was a custodian. He was certifying the accuracy of his transmission. That practice is not associated with mythology in Mesopotamian scribal culture. It is associated with records. The story the Atrahasis tells begins before the flood. It begins before humanity. It begins with labor. The Igigi, the younger or lower-ranking gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon, are assigned the work of maintaining the physical infrastructure of the world. They dig canals. They dredge riverbeds. They maintain the irrigation systems that make agriculture possible in the alluvial plain. The infrastructure described in the text corresponds to the actual hydraulic engineering that sustained Mesopotamian civilization for millennia, the vast canal networks that transformed the marshlands and floodplains of the Tigris-Euphrates Delta into some of the most productive agricultural land in the ancient world. The scale of this infrastructure was immense. Archaeological surveys have mapped canal systems extending for hundreds of kilometers across the southern Mesopotamian plain, systems that required constant maintenance against silting, erosion, and seasonal flooding. The Atrahasis frames this infrastructure as the specific work that the Igigi were created or assigned to perform, and the text records their labor as backbreaking and relentless. For 40 years, the text says, the Igigi bore the toil. Then they revolt. They burn their tools. They march on the dwelling of Enlil, the chief administrator, and refuse to work. This is a labor strike. The text describes it with the same procedural specificity that characterizes the later divine assembly scene. The Igigi have a grievance. They express it collectively. They take organized action. And the response of the senior gods is not punishment, it is problem-solving. The council convenes. They discuss the crisis, and Enki proposes a solution. Create a new being, a being made from clay and the blood of a sacrificed god, capable of bearing the labor that the Igigi have refused. Humanity is the solution to a workforce management crisis. That is the origin story in the Atrahasis. Not a divine gift, not a cosmic purpose, a staffing decision. The implications of this framing run deeper than most commentators acknowledge. If the creation of humanity is an administrative response to a labor dispute, then human existence is contingent on economic need. Humanity was not created because the gods loved the idea of humans. Humanity was created because the existing labor force went on strike and a replacement was needed. The entire theological framework that later traditions built around human creation, the idea that humanity was made in the image of God, that human life has inherent divine purpose, can be read as a reinterpretation of an older, harder story, a story in which human beings are a manufactured product designed to perform a function. The Atrahasis does not soften this, it states it plainly. The Igigi refused the work, the council needed workers, Enki designed a replacement. The replacement is us. The god whose blood is used in the creation is named in the text. His name is Geshtu-A. The text identifies him as a god who had intelligence, whose blood and flesh are mixed with the clay to produce the first human beings. The conventional reading interprets this as a mythological explanation for human consciousness. Humanity possesses intelligence because it was made with the substance of an intelligent divine being. Sitchin's reading interprets it as a record of genetic contribution. The specific selection of a god, described as possessing intelligence, rather than strength or beauty or any other attribute, suggests that the quality being transferred is cognitive capacity. The new beings need to be intelligent enough to perform complex labor, to understand instructions, to operate within an administered system. They need to be smart enough to work, but not so autonomous that they cannot be managed. The Atrahasis describes the result of this procedure in terms that suggest both satisfaction and anxiety on the part of the creators. The beings work, but they also multiply, and in multiplying they become noisy, disruptive, and numerous beyond the intended parameters. Enki's relationship to humanity across the Sumerian and Akkadian literary corpus is consistent. He is the protector. He is the trickster. He is the one who bends rules, who finds workarounds, who sides with the underdog in divine disputes. His cult center was Eridu, widely considered the oldest continuously occupied city in southern Mesopotamia, located in what is now the Dishikar Governorate of Iraq. Eridu's archaeological layers extend down through thousands of years of occupation, with the earliest levels dating to approximately 5,400 BCE, making it one of the longest attested settlement sites in human history. The excavations conducted at Eridu by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd in the 1940s and 1950s revealed a sequence of 18 superimposed temple structures, each built on the foundation of the previous one, extending from simple reed shrines at the lowest levels to substantial mud-brick temple platforms at the upper levels. The temple at Eridu, dedicated to Enki, is among the oldest temple structures ever excavated in Mesopotamia, and the continuity of the sacred site across millennia suggests that the worship of Enki at this location was one of the most enduring religious traditions in the ancient Near East. Enki's domain was the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that the Mesopotamians believed lay beneath the surface of the earth, the source of springs, wells, and rivers. He was the god of wisdom, of craft, of the sweet waters that sustain life. He was the keeper of the Mi, the divine decrees that governed civilization, technology, and social order. In one of the most celebrated Sumerian literary compositions, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu and persuades Enki, through a combination of charm and intoxicating drink, to surrender the Mi to her. The text lists the Mi in exhaustive detail. They include kingship, priesthood, truth, the descent into the underworld, the art of metalworking, the art of leatherworking, the scribal art, the art of building, wisdom, attention, holy purification, and dozens more. The Mi are not abstract spiritual qualities. They are technologies, institutional structures, and bodies of knowledge. They are the operating system of civilization. Kramer counted more than 100 distinct Mi in the Sumerian literary corpus. They include practical arts like woodworking and copper smelting, alongside institutional concepts like the exercise of power and the establishment of cities. The breadth of the list suggests that the Sumerians conceived of civilization not as a gradual human achievement, but as a defined package, a set of discrete capabilities that were bestowed, transferred, and administered by specific divine custodians. If you read the Mi as technology transfers rather than mythological gifts, the implications are significant. Civilization did not develop organically, it was deployed, and Enki is the custodian who controlled the deployment. The god who guards the operating system of civilization is the same god who, when the council voted to destroy everything his engineering had created, found a reed wall and started talking. The cosmological framework of the Atrahasis positions the flood not as an anomaly, but as the climax of a structural tension that existed from the moment of humanity's creation. The gods created beings capable of labor and endowed them with the intelligence of a sacrificed divine being. But they did not build in a mechanism for population control. The text is clear on this point, and the clarity has the character of a retrospective diagnosis rather than a narrative observation. Humanity multiplies. The noise increases. Enlil cannot sleep. The noise, rendered in Akkadian as Rigmu or Huburu depending on the passage, is described as a persistent and escalating disturbance that grows in proportion to the human population. The noise, in the conventional reading, is a metaphor for the disruption that an uncontrolled population causes to the divine order. In Sitchin's reading, it is a literal reference to the observable consequences of demographic growth in a managed system. Either way, the text frames the problem as a design flaw. The product works too well, it reproduces too efficiently, and the governing body's response is not to redesign the product, but to destroy the batch and start over. Enki's objection, read in this light, is not sentimental, it is professional. A competent engineer does not destroy a functional prototype because the management team failed to anticipate scaling issues. A competent engineer argues for revision, for iteration, for a patch. And that is exactly what the post-flood settlement represents. The restrictions on human reproduction and lifespan imposed after the floodwaters recede are the patch. They are the population control mechanisms that should have been built into the original design. The text does not celebrate his defection. That is an important detail. In a mythological framework, the hero who defies the gods to save humanity is typically glorified. Prometheus steals fire and is lionized by later tradition, even as he suffers divine punishment. But the Atrahasis does not lionize Enki. It records his action and its consequences with the same procedural neutrality that characterizes the rest of the narrative. He circumvents the oath. Atrahasis builds the boat. The flood comes. Humanity survives through the remnant that Enki preserved. And the council, when it reconvenes after the waters recede, is angry. Enlil is furious that humanity has survived. But the text does not frame this as a triumph. It frames it as a problem that now requires a new administrative solution. The gods institute new measures to limit human reproduction and lifespan. Birth restrictions, infant mortality, celibate priestesses who will not bear children. The post-flood settlement in the Atrahasis is not a covenant of grace. It is a revised population management program. And Enki's role in it is not that of a savior. It is that of an engineer who broke protocol, preserved his project, and now has to live with the institutional consequences of his decision. The Atrahasis does not end with resolution. It ends with a new administrative framework, one that acknowledges the continued existence of humanity while imposing constraints that the original design lacked. The text describes the establishment of 3 classes of women who will not bear children, a mechanism for limiting reproductive output that operates through social and institutional structures rather than through biological modification. It describes the institution of infant mortality as a population check, a mechanism that is horrifying to modern sensibility, but functionally effective as a demographic control within the parameters of the text. It describes the appointment of a specific class of priestesses dedicated to celibacy, removing a proportion of the female population from the reproductive pool permanently. These are not blessings, they are engineering specifications for a revised biological program, and the text presents them without moral commentary. They are decisions. Administrative decisions made by a governing body adjusting its policies in the aftermath of a catastrophic event that it deliberately allowed to occur and that one of its own members covertly undermined. The emotional register of the Atrahasis in its closing sections is not triumph, it is not tragedy, it is procedure. The committee meets, the committee adjusts, the committee moves on. There is a moment in the Atrahasis, just before the flood, that the conventional reading tends to pass over quickly. The text describes the sky darkening, it describes the wind rising, it describes the sound of the approaching water, and it describes the gods themselves becoming afraid. The beings who ordered the destruction are terrified by its magnitude They retreat to the upper heavens. They cower. Anu's heaven, the highest tier of the Mesopotamian cosmos, becomes a refuge for the very beings who authorized the catastrophe below. The text describes them pressing against the walls of Anu's domain like dogs. That image, the gods cowering like frightened animals before the consequences of their own decision, is one of the most psychologically complex moments in ancient literature. It suggests that the council did not fully understand what it had unleashed. The decision to allow the flood was made in the abstract. The reality of the flood exceeded the abstraction. The gap between the policy and its execution is one of the most recognizable features of institutional decision-making in any era, and the Atrahasis records it with a precision that does not feel mythological. The council members who voted for destruction did not anticipate what destruction would actually look like when it arrived at full scale. They did not expect to be afraid of their own instrument. And yet the text records their fear without irony, without judgment, without the moral commentary that a mythological frame would almost certainly provide. And Enki, the one member who had tried to prevent this outcome, who had run the covert resistance, who had spoken to the reed wall, is somewhere below, watching the waters rise, knowing that everything he built is being swept away except for the one vessel he managed to commission through a legal technicality. The tablets that record all of this are in the British Museum. They have been there since Hormuzd-Rassam and his predecessors brought them out of the mound of Kuyunjik at Nineveh in the middle of the 19th century. The old Babylonian fragments, the ones Ipiq-Aya copied, came through separate acquisitions and were assembled by Lambert and Millard over years of patient philological work. The text is available. The critical edition is in print. The procedural structure of the Divine Assembly is visible to any reader who approaches the text without the prior assumption that it must be mythology. And the question of why a mythological text would preserve the specific mechanics of a legal workaround has been in print since 1969. It has not been answered. The Atrahasis is not the only ancient text that records a factional rupture among a governing class of divine beings in the lead-up to a catastrophic flood. It is not even the most detailed. The Book of Enoch, preserved in its most complete form in the Ge'ez language of the Ethiopian Orthodox canon and dating in its earliest compositional layers to the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, describes a group of divine beings called the Watchers, who are assigned to oversee humanity. The Watchers are not gods in the Mesopotamian sense. They are administrators. They are stationed on earth with a mandate to observe and, in some readings, to instruct. And they fracture. A faction led by a figure named Shemihaza decides to descend to the human plane, take human wives, and produce offspring. These offspring are the Nephilim, beings of enormous size and appetite, whose existence destabilizes the human world. The decision to descend is collective. The Watchers swear an oath on Mount Hermon, binding themselves to the transgression so that no individual can withdraw and avoid the consequences. The structural parallel to the Atrahasis is precise. A governing body of divine overseers, a collective oath, a factional split, a transgression against the established order, and a catastrophic consequence, the flood, sent to destroy the hybrid offspring and reset the human world. But the Book of Enoch adds a layer that the Atrahasis leaves implicit. The Watchers who descend do not merely interbreed with humans. They transfer knowledge. They teach metallurgy. They teach the use of cosmetics and the art of enchantment. They teach astronomy and the reading of celestial signs. A figure named Azazel teaches humanity the making of swords and shields, the techniques of warfare that transform human communities from pastoral settlements into militarized societies capable of organized violence. Another Watcher teaches the art of reading celestial signs, the observation of stars and planets that forms the foundation of both astronomy and astrology in the ancient world. The text identifies these knowledge transfers as transgressions, as violations of the boundary between divine and human competence that were never authorized by the senior divine authority, and that carry consequences extending far beyond the immediate recipients of the forbidden knowledge. The parallel to the Sumerian concept of the me, the divine decrees that Enki custodied, is striking. In both traditions, specific bodies of knowledge are held by a divine governing class, and are not supposed to be shared with humanity without authorization. In both traditions, the unauthorized transfer of that knowledge to humans is a triggering event for catastrophic divine response. The Enochic tradition frames this as a moral failure on the part of the Watchers. The Atrahasis frames it as a bureaucratic crisis within the divine administration, but the underlying architecture is the same. A governing class possesses knowledge. Members of that class leak the knowledge to humans. The governing class responds with destruction. The geographic and temporal separation between the Atrahasis and the Enochic tradition complicates the standard diffusion explanation. The Atrahasis was composed in Old Babylonian Mesopotamia in the early 2nd millennium BCE. The Book of Enoch was composed in Jewish and possibly broader Levantine communities in the late 1st millennium BCE. There is obvious cultural contact between Mesopotamia and the Levant across the intervening centuries, and scholars like Stephanie Daly have documented extensive borrowing of Mesopotamian literary motifs in Hebrew and Jewish apocalyptic literature. Diffusion is a real and well-documented phenomenon, but diffusion typically transmits surface elements, narrative motifs, character names, plot devices. What it does not typically transmit is structural architecture. The Atrahasis and the Book of Enoch share not just the story of a flood, but the specific political mechanism that generates it: a governing body, an oath, a dissenter, a covert warning. Diffusion can explain the flood motif. It does not easily explain the oath. The Popol Vuh, the creation narrative of the Quiche Maya of the Guatemalan highlands, recorded in alphabetic Quiche in the mid-16th century from older oral traditions, describes a series of creation and destruction cycles carried out by a divine council. The gods create experimental human prototypes. They evaluate the results. When the prototypes fail to meet the specifications, they destroy them and begin again. The first humans are made of mud. They dissolve. The second are made of wood. They are functional, but lack consciousness, moving through the world without awareness, without gratitude, without the capacity to honor their makers. They are destroyed by flood, by a deluge of boiling resin according to some versions of the tradition, a catastrophe that erases the failed prototype and clears the way for the next attempt. The third are made of maize dough, the sacred grain that sustains Mesoamerican civilization, and these beings work. They see clearly, too clearly. The gods become concerned that these beings, endowed with sight that penetrates the heavens, will rival their creators. They limit human perception. The parallel to the Atrahasis is architectural rather than narrative. In both texts, a divine governing body creates humanity through iterative experimentation, evaluates the results against functional criteria, and intervenes to restrict or destroy the product when it exceeds its intended parameters. The Popol Vuh does not share the Mesopotamian cultural context. There is no documented transmission path between Old Babylonian Sippar and the Quiche highlands of Mesoamerica. The parallels are structural, not textual, and the conventional explanation for structural parallels without a transmission path is that the structures reflect universal patterns in human mythological thinking, shared cognitive architecture, shared anxieties about the relationship between creators and their creations. This is a reasonable hypothesis. It may well be correct, but it does not explain why the specific political mechanism, the governing council that creates, evaluates, and destroys, recurs with such precision across traditions that had no contact. The Matsya Purana, one of the 18 major Puranas of the Hindu tradition, describes the god Vishnu taking the form of a fish, Matsya, to warn the sage Manu of an impending deluge. Vishnu instructs Manu to build a vessel and to preserve the seeds of all living things. The flood comes. Manu survives. Humanity is renewed through his lineage. The structural elements are by now familiar. A divine being possessing foreknowledge of a catastrophic event breaks from the established order to warn a single human individual. The warning is covert. The preparation is specific. The survival vessel is purpose-built. The text dates in its current form to approximately the 1st millennium CE, but the Matsya tradition draws on much older Vedic material, and the story of Manu and the fish appears in the Shatapatha Brahmana, which is dated to approximately the 8th to 6th centuries BCE. The fish avatar who warns Manu is not a rebel in the same way that Enki is a rebel, and the Hindu tradition frames the warning within a broader cosmological cycle of creation and destruction that gives the flood a different theological significance than it carries in the Mesopotamian context. But the function is identical in structural terms. A being with access to information that the human recipient cannot obtain independently transfers that information at personal or institutional cost. The mechanism is the point, not the mythology. The mechanism. 4 traditions: Mesopotamian, Jewish, Mesoamerican, Hindu. 4 independent or semi-independent textual families separated by thousands of kilometers, and in some cases, thousands of years. Each preserves a narrative in which a divine governing class decides to destroy humanity, and a dissenting member of that class warns a chosen human survivor through a covert communication that violates or circumvents the collective decision of the governing body. The conventional explanation accounts for 2 of the 4 through documented cultural contact between Mesopotamia and the Levantine world through which the Enochic tradition developed. It cannot account for all 4 through diffusion alone, because the Mesoamerican and South Asian traditions developed in cultural contexts where Mesopotamian textual influence has not been demonstrated through any accepted archaeological or philological evidence. And the alternative hypothesis, that the shared structure reflects a shared source, an actual event or set of events that multiple cultures remembered and encoded in their foundational texts, has not been refuted. It has been characterized as speculative. Characterization is not refutation. The Yoruba Ifa divination corpus, preserved in oral tradition across West Africa and now documented in ethnographic literature, contains narratives of divine beings who descend, interact with humanity, and provoke the intervention of a senior divine authority. The Dogon tradition of Mali, documented by French anthropologists Marcel Griaule and Germaine Dieterlen in the mid-20th century, and subsequently debated within the anthropological community, includes accounts of beings from the star system of Sirius who brought knowledge and established institutional structures among humans. The Dogon material is contested, and some scholars have argued that Griaule's informants may have incorporated astronomical knowledge acquired from European contact into their oral traditions. That debate is unresolved, but the structural element, divine beings transferring institutional knowledge to humans, is attested in the tradition regardless of the debate about the Sirius detail. These traditions are geographically and culturally remote from both Mesopotamia and the Levant. They were not transmitted through cuneiform channels. They were preserved orally across millennia by communities with no documented contact with the ancient Near East. And yet the structural architecture recurs: a governing divine class, a subset that interacts with humanity, a transfer of knowledge, a catastrophic reset. The question of what produced this convergence has not been seriously investigated in any interdisciplinary academic framework. The anthropological explanation, universal human cognitive patterns, has been asserted but never demonstrated with the kind of structural specificity that the parallel demands. Characterization is not refutation. The strongest objection to the procedural reading of the Atrahasis is not Heiser's linguistic critique, although Heiser's work is the most technically rigorous counterargument available. The strongest objection is methodological. It asks whether it is legitimate to read Bronze Age literary conventions through the lens of modern institutional analysis. The Mesopotamians had a rich tradition of literary composition. Their scribes were trained in poetic structure, in parallelism, in the use of formulaic language. The procedural detail that Sitchin identified as evidence of a documentary record could, in this objection, be a product of a literary tradition that valued narrative specificity for its own sake. The Old Babylonian period was an era of literary sophistication. The scribes who produced the Atrahasis were not primitive recorders. They were skilled writers working within a highly developed compositional tradition. The oath, the escalation, the reed wall, the legal workaround could all be features of a masterful literary technique rather than evidence of a recorded event. This objection deserves to be taken seriously. It is not a dismissal. It is an argument. It identifies a genuine interpretive problem. The question is whether literary sophistication and documentary content are mutually exclusive. The answer, on reflection, is not obvious. Modern legal transcripts are written in highly structured prose. Parliamentary minutes are composed with care and precision. The literary quality of a document does not determine whether its content is fictional or factual. A skillfully written record is still a record. The question is not whether the Atrahasis is well written. The question is whether its specific procedural features serve a narrative purpose or a documentary one. And here, the objection loses force. Because the procedural details in the Atrahasis do not serve the narrative, they complicate it. The oath makes the plot more convoluted. The reed wall workaround makes the warning scene less dramatic. A writer seeking narrative impact would have simplified these elements. A recorder seeking accuracy would have preserved them. The strongest objection to the procedural reading, when examined carefully, actually reinforces the strongest argument for it. The procedural complexity exists despite its narrative cost, and that is a signature not of literary invention, but of documentary fidelity. The debate remains genuinely unresolved. Heiser's linguistic objections stand, the methodological objection about literary convention stands, and the structural observation about the procedural character of the Atrahasis also stands. No synthesis has been attempted in any peer-reviewed venue. No scholar has published a comprehensive assessment weighing the procedural reading against the mythological reading using the full range of available evidence. The conversation that should have happened in the 1970s and 1980s, after Sitchin published his textual arguments and Heiser published his counter-arguments, never took place. The academic infrastructure for that conversation does not exist, because the institutional decision to classify Sitchin as pseudo-archaeology precluded the possibility of treating his structural observations as a legitimate research question. There is also the question of selection bias. Sitchin and readers sympathetic to his framework tend to emphasize the procedural elements of the Atrahasis, while downplaying the elements that are unambiguously mythological. The text contains divine beings who weep, who cower, who express emotion in ways that do not fit the administrative record interpretation cleanly. The gods in the Atrahasis are not purely bureaucratic. They are literary characters with emotional depth, internal conflict, and dramatic arcs that would satisfy the requirements of any literary analysis. They weep when humanity suffers. They cower when the flood exceeds their expectations. They argue among themselves with a psychological realism that transcends administrative record-keeping. The procedural elements coexist with literary elements, and any honest reading must account for both dimensions of the text, rather than privileging one at the expense of the other. The question is whether the literary elements negate the procedural ones, or whether a document can be simultaneously literary and documentary, a record that is also artfully composed. That question has analogies in modern historiography. Thucydides wrote artful prose. His speeches are literary constructions. His history is still treated as documentary. The mere presence of literary craft does not disqualify a text from evidentiary status. Ancient Egyptian court records are composed with literary care. Ancient Chinese annals use formulaic structures that serve both aesthetic and documentary functions. But the question of where the line falls in the Atrahasis remains genuinely open, and it is complicated by the possibility that the text itself does not respect the categories that modern scholars impose on it. The distinction between literary and documentary may be a modern artifact, a product of post-Enlightenment categorization that does not map cleanly onto the intellectual culture of old Babylonian Mesopotamia. The scribes who produced and transmitted the Atrahasis may not have understood themselves to be working in either a purely literary or a purely documentary mode, but rather in a mode for which we do not have a convenient modern label, a mode in which narrative art and institutional memory coexisted within a single textual tradition, without the tension that modern readers perceive between them. The question is not settled, it is abandoned. If the structural reading is substantially correct, even partially, the consequences for the conventional understanding of early human history are difficult to overstate. It would mean that the oldest extended prose narrative in human literary history is not a story, It is a transcript. It would mean that the clay tablets Ipiq-Aya copied in Old Babylonian Sippar more than 3,600 years ago preserve not the imaginings of ancient scribes, but the institutional memory of an actual governing body that made actual decisions about the creation, management, and attempted destruction of a biological labor force designed to replace a previous workforce that had gone on strike. It would mean that Enki's defection was not a mythological motif but a political act, documented by the institution it occurred within, preserved through a scribal tradition that treated the text as authoritative rather than literary, and transmitted across 3,600 years to a clay tablet now sitting in a climate-controlled storage facility in London. The conventional timeline of human civilization, which places the development of complex societies in the 4th millennium BCE and attributes the emergence of writing, agriculture, and urban life to indigenous human innovation, would require fundamental revision. The Sumerian king list's antediluvian chronology, dismissed as numerological fantasy, would need to be reconsidered as a potential data source. The archaeological record of southern Mesopotamia, already rich in anomalous flood deposits and unexplained stratigraphic breaks, would need to be re-examined through a lens that takes the Atrahasis narrative seriously as a historical source rather than a literary one. The institutional cost of this revision is enormous. It would require not a minor adjustment to existing models, but a wholesale rethinking of the assumptions that underpin ancient Near Eastern studies. That cost is part of why the question remains unasked. It would mean that the reed wall is not a metaphor. It is an instrument of covert communication used by a dissenting engineer to circumvent a binding oath imposed by a governing council that had voted to destroy his life's work. The tablets are real. The scribe signed his name. The critical edition is in print. And the question of what kind of document Ipiq-Aya believed he was copying has never been asked in any academic setting where the answer might be taken seriously. The Atrahasis tablets are in the British Museum. They have been there for more than a century and a half. The old Babylonian fragments that Ipiq-Aya copied are among the oldest scribe-attributed literary manuscripts in the cuneiform record. Lambert and Millard published the critical edition through Oxford University Press in 1969. The text records a divine assembly. The assembly votes. It imposes an oath. The oath targets a dissenter. The dissenter finds a loophole. He speaks to a reed wall. A man on the other side listens. That man builds a boat. The flood comes. The species survives by the margin of one legal technicality. The question of why a mythological text would preserve the specific mechanism of a contractual workaround has not received a published academic response. The tablets are still in the museum. The text is still in print. The question is still open. It has been open since Hormuzd-Rassam pulled the first fragments out of the rubble at Nineveh in the 1850s. It is still open now.